17 Brazilian merchant ships sunk, more than 1,000 civilian lives lost. German U-boats operating freely along the South American coastline, treating Brazilian waters like a private hunting ground. Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy in August 1942. Then nothing happened. Not because Brazil didn't mean it, not because the government wasn't serious, but because what came next, the question of actually sending soldiers to fight in Europe, cracked open a political fault line so deep, so tangled, and so publicly humiliating that Brazilian citizens coined a phrase for it. A phrase that spread through barracks, through newspapers, through Rio de Janeiro street corners, until it became the unofficial verdict of an entire nation on its own military's ability to act. Mais fácil uma cobra fumar do que a FEB embarcar. Sooner will a snake smoke than the Brazilian Expeditionary Force will sail. Read that again. This was not enemy propaganda. This was not German psychological warfare, designed to demoralize Brazilian troops. This was Brazilians, soldiers, civilians, journalists, politicians, talking about their own army, their own expeditionary force, their own men. The snake became the symbol of a nation's collective disbelief in itself. And by the time you finish this story, you will understand exactly what it took to make that snake light a cigarette. To understand why nobody believed the FEB was going anywhere, you have to understand what Brazil looked like in 1942. Getúlio Vargas had been running the country since 1930. By 1937, he had dissolved Congress, suspended the Constitution, and declared the Estado Novo, the new state, a nationalist authoritarian regime, modeled in part on European fascism. Vargas had openly admired Mussolini. He had maintained commercial relationships with Nazi Germany. Brazilian steel and strategic minerals had flowed toward the Axis throughout the early war years. Then the U-boats came. Between February and August of FEB 1942, German submarines sank 36 Brazilian vessels, merchant ships, civilian crews, men who had nothing to do with any war. The attack that broke the political deadlock came in August 1942, when 5 Brazilian ships were torpedoed within 4 days. More than 600 people died. Public outrage in Brazil reached a temperature that even Vargas, with all his political calculation, could not ignore. Brazil declared war on August 22, 1942. But declaring war and fighting one are two entirely different things. And what followed the declaration was nearly 2 years of institutional paralysis that made the snake idiom feel less like dark humor and more like plain reporting. The Brazilian Army in 1942 was not a force built for expeditionary warfare. It was a force built for internal order, for border security, for the kind of political stability operations that authoritarian governments require of their militaries. Its officer corps was trained in doctrine that had not been seriously updated since the First World War. Its equipment was a patchwork of aging European material. Its enlisted ranks were drawn heavily from men with no formal military education, many from Brazil's rural interior, where literacy rates were low and military training was essentially non-existent. General Eurico Gaspar Dutra, the Minister of War, was skeptical from the beginning. A significant portion of the Brazilian officer corps shared his view. They did not believe their force could be made ready in any timeline that would matter to the European war. Some believed it would be a catastrophe. Others believed it was politically motivated theater. Vargas burnishing Brazil's international standing without any genuine military intention behind it. They were not entirely wrong to be skeptical. The logistics alone were staggering. Brazil had no experience projecting military force across an ocean. It had no established supply chain to Europe. It had no cold weather warfare doctrine. It had no working relationship with Allied command structures. And it was being asked to do all of this while subordinating its forces to American operational command. A sovereignty question that generated its own separate political crisis inside the Vargas government. The negotiations with Washington were complicated and slow. The Americans had their own doubts. Brazil's military was an unknown quantity. Tropical soldiers, untested officers, a chain of command that ran through a government whose ideological alignment with the Allied cause was, to put it charitably, recent. Inside Brazil, the debate dragged on through 1942 and into 1943. Units were designated, reorganized, redesignated. Training programs were proposed, modified, underfunded. Equipment requests were submitted to Washington and returned incomplete. The FEB, the Força Expedicionária Brasileira, existed on paper long before it existed as a functioning military organization. And the longer it existed only on paper, the more the snake idiom settled into the culture as settled fact. Even within the force itself, confidence was not universal. Officers who had been assigned to FEB units spoke privately about the uncertainty. Some requested reassignment. The expedition felt, to many who were supposed to be part of it, like something that would always be about to happen, perpetually imminent, perpetually delayed, ultimately unlikely. The first contingent of Brazilian soldiers sailed for Italy in July 1944. 25,334 men would eventually make the crossing. They departed in multiple convoys across 1944 and into 1945, traveling in American transport ships under U.S. Navy escort, crossing an Atlantic that German submarines still patrolled. They carried with them a century of having never fought an external war. They carried the weight of 2 years of their own country's doubt. They carried the snake. What they were sailing toward was the Italian campaign, one of the most grinding, costly, and strategically complex Allied operations of the entire war. The Italian peninsula is not a natural highway. It is a series of river valleys and mountain ridges that run perpendicular to any army advancing from the south, each one a natural defensive line, each one requiring frontal assault against fortified positions held by German forces who had spent months digging in. The Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, the Northern Apennines. Names that would become, for Brazilian soldiers, something more than geography. The Allies who received them in Italy had their own assessment of what the FEB was likely to be worth. Those assessments had been forming since the negotiations began. They were not generous. What the Allied command was expecting when those ships arrived, and what they actually got, is where this story truly begins. When the first Brazilian convoy arrived at Naples in July 1944, the Americans who received them were polite, professionally polite, the kind of polite that contains, just beneath the surface, a fully formed opinion that nobody is saying out loud. The opinion was this: the FEB was a political gesture dressed in a uniform. This was not paranoia on the Brazilians' part. It was the operational reality they stepped into from the moment their boots touched Italian soil. The U.S. Fifth Army, under General Mark Clark, had been fighting up the Italian peninsula since September 1943. His men had crossed the Rapido River, stormed Monte Castelo, broken the Gustav Line. They were exhausted, battle-hardened, and deeply territorial about their operational standards. Into this environment arrived 25,000 soldiers from a country that had never fought a foreign war in living memory. Speaking a language almost nobody in the Allied command structure understood, wearing uniforms that were already AI. Problem before a single shot had been fired. The uniforms were American, the rifles were American, the field rations were American, the vehicles were American, the doctrine was supposed to be American. But the men inside all of that American equipment had been trained inconsistently in Brazil by an officer corps working from pre-war European manuals, in a climate that bore no resemblance to what they were about to face. The northern Apennines in winter are not the Amazon. They are not the Cerrado. They are not anything in the Brazilian geographic experience. They are stone ridges at elevation, swept by wind, covered in snow and ice from November through March, with temperatures that kill exposed men who are not equipped for them. The FEB arrived in the Italian summer. The cold was coming. And the cold weather gear situation was, from the beginning, a crisis that the Allied supply chain treated as a secondary priority. General João Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes commanded the FEB. He was 58 years old when he arrived in Italy. A career officer, methodical, formal, deeply conscious of what his force represented, not just militarily, but nationally. He understood with a clarity that some of his American counterparts did not bother to develop, that every decision made about the FEB in Italy would echo back to Brazil, that the men under his command were carrying something heavier than their field packs. Mascarenhas was not a general who inspired through charisma. He inspired through stubborn institutional dignity. He fought, constantly, through proper channels, with careful documentation, for his force to be treated as a legitimate combat organization rather than a supplementary labor pool. Because that was the other thing, there were elements within Allied planning that viewed the Brazilians primarily as a manpower reserve, bodies to hold secondary sectors. A warm presence on the line that freed American divisions for more critical operations. Mascarenhas understood this and pushed back against it at every level available to him. He was operating inside a command structure where his force was subordinate to U.S. 4 Corps, where his operational requests required American approval, where his logistics ran through American supply channels that did not prioritize him, and where the working language of command was English, which he did not speak fluently, and which the vast majority of his officers and all of his enlisted men did not speak at all. The language problem was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was a daily operational reality that shaped everything from intelligence briefings to supply requests to fire support coordination. American liaison officers assigned to the FEB quickly discovered that their role was less liaison and more translation service, and not just linguistically, culturally, doctrinally. The gap between how the Brazilian Army understood military operations and how U.S. 4 Corps ran them was wide, enough to cause genuine confusion at the tactical level. One American officer attached to FEB headquarters in late 1944, whose reports survive in the U.S. Army's operational archives from the Italian campaign, wrote that coordinating with the Brazilian staff required patience of a kind not covered in his training. He was not being contemptuous. He was being accurate. The FEB staff was working in an institutional framework that had been built in weeks, not years. They were professional men doing an improvised job under real combat conditions, and the Americans watching them knew it. What those American observers did not always account for was what the men themselves were carrying into this situation. The soldiers of the FEB came from across Brazil, from São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, from Minas Gerais and the rural Northeast. They were drawn from a country of extreme social stratification, and that stratification came with them into the ranks. The officer corps was overwhelmingly white and urban. The enlisted ranks were overwhelmingly black and mixed race, drawn from the poorest segments of Brazilian society, men for whom military service was sometimes the first stable employment they had known. These men had been processed through training that was, depending on when and where they went through it, somewhere between inadequate and genuinely poor. The mobilization timeline was too compressed, the training infrastructure too limited, the doctrine too unsettled for consistent preparation. Some units arrived in Italy having fired their weapons a handful of times in training. Some had never operated in the mountains. Almost none had experienced anything approximating the combat environment they were entering, and they knew they were being watched, not just by their officers, not just by the Americans, by Brazil itself. The press was following the FEB. The Vargas government was watching for any outcome that could be used politically. The soldiers in the ranks. Châteauly, Men who had left families, who had crossed the Atlantic on ships that German submarines still hunted, who had arrived in a country they had never seen to fight, in a war that had come to Brazil on the decks of torpedoed merchant vessels. Those men understood, without needing it explained, that failure would not be forgotten. The weight of that was not incidental. It was present in every patrol briefing, every mess line, every night position dug into Italian hillside. The FEB carried its country's doubt the way you carry something you cannot set down. By September 1944, the FEB had been assigned to the 4th Corps sector of the 5th Army Front. They took over defensive positions, conducted patrols, made initial contact with German units. Small actions, probing operations, the kind of combat that does not make headlines but does produce casualties and does reveal quickly where the gaps in preparation are. The gaps were real. But so was something else, something the American. Assessments from that early period note with a consistency that complicates the condescending narrative. The Brazilians were aggressive, perhaps unexpectedly so. They did not shy from contact. They did not fold under fire. They pushed into situations that their training had not fully prepared them for, and they found ways through. None of that changed the institutional reality. The FEB was still an unknown quantity in Allied planning, still a force whose ceiling nobody had established, still an army that its own country had doubted into existence. Then came the assignment that would define everything. The mountain was called Monte Castelo. It sat in the northern Apennines at roughly 1,000 meters elevation, held by the German 148th Infantry Division behind fortified positions that had been prepared for months. It dominated the entire 4th Corps axis of advance. Until it fell, nothing behind it could move. The FEB was ordered to take it. They tried 4 times. Monte Castelo is not a dramatic mountain. It does not have the kind of profile that looks dangerous from a distance. At 1,111 meters, it sits in the northern Apennines as part of a ridge system that runs roughly east to west, its slopes covered in chestnut forest and scrub, its summit unremarkable to any eye that has not studied what was sitting on top of it. What was sitting on top of it was the German 148th Infantry Division, dug into positions they had been preparing since the autumn of 1944. Reinforced bunkers, interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. Artillery pre-registered on every trail, every draw, every natural line of movement up the slope. The Germans had chosen this ground deliberately. They understood what it controlled. The entire 4th Corps axis of advance northward through the Reno Valley ran through the shadow of Monte Castelo. As long as it held, the Allied offensive stalled. As long as it held, the road to Bologna stayed closed. The FEB was assigned responsibility for this sector in October 1944. They did not choose the objective. It was handed to them, and the conditions under which they were expected to take it were from the beginning a compounding series of problems that the operational record documents with uncomfortable clarity. The weather arrived before the orders did. The winter of 1944 to 1945 in the northern Apennines was severe by any measure. By November, the mountains were carrying snow at elevation. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night and barely recovered during the day. The trails that served as the primary approach routes to Monte Castelo became ice and mud, alternating with each other depending on the hour, neither condition conducive to moving men and equipment uphill under fire. The cold weather gear situation, already problematic when the FEB arrived in Italy, became critical. American supply channels were prioritizing other sectors. Brazilian soldiers were fighting in conditions for which they were materially unprepared, and in some cases physically unprepared in ways that went beyond equipment. Men from the Brazilian Northeast, from coastal cities, from the interior lowlands, had never experienced sustained cold. Frostbite became a medical problem alongside combat wounds. The FEB's medical records from November and December 1944 list cold weather injuries as a consistent category of casualties alongside those produced by German fire. This is not a minor footnote. It is the operational context inside which every assault on Monte Castelo was conducted. Men who were cold, inadequately equipped for the terrain, fighting uphill against prepared positions with artillery coordination that would prove, on multiple occasions, to be the difference between a viable assault and a catastrophe. The first assault came on November 24, 1944. The plan called for a coordinated attack by elements of the Brazilian 1st Infantry Division, supported by American artillery and air support. The FEB's 6th Regiment Infantry led the assault on the southern and southwestern approaches. What the plan could not account for, what no plan could fully account for, was the gap between the scheduled timing of Allied air support and the actual moment ground troops made contact with German forward positions. The air support was late. The artillery preparation was insufficient against the depth of the German fortifications. The Brazilian infantry advanced into positions that had not been adequately suppressed. The German 148th held its ground and directed fire onto approach routes with the accuracy of men shooting at targets they had pre-registered weeks earlier. The assault was repulsed. The FEB pulled back, reorganized, counted its dead and wounded, and reported to 4th Corps. The second attempt came on December 8, 1944. The tactical approach was adjusted. The support coordination was reworked. The FEB went back up the same mountain against the same defenders in conditions that had worsened since November. Snow was heavier. The trails were worse. The German positions had, if anything, been further improved during the interval. The second assault was repulsed. The third attempt came on December 12th, 4 days after the second failure. The operational logic was that sustained pressure would degrade German defensive capability faster than allowing recovery time. The logic was not wrong in principle. In practice, on this mountain, in this weather, against this particular defensive preparation, it produced a third withdrawal. The fourth attempt came on December 29th. Christmas had passed in the mountains. The FEB had spent it in positions below a ridge that had now absorbed 4 weeks of their attempts. The December 29th assault reached further up the slope than the previous 3. It was not enough. The German line held. The FEB came back down. 4 assaults, 4 withdrawals. Significant casualties across all 4 attempts. The exact figures vary across sources, but the FEB's losses in the Monte Castelo sector during November and December 1944, killed, wounded, missing, and non-combat casualties from cold weather injuries and illness, were substantial enough to register as a genuine attrition problem for a force of the FEB's size. What the operational record also shows, and what is important to state clearly, is that the failures at Monte Castelo were not primarily failures of Brazilian soldiers. They were failures of tactical conditions, insufficient fire support, inadequate cold weather preparation, coordination problems between ground and air that were a systemic issue across the Italian campaign, not a problem unique to the FEB sector. The German position was formidable. It had repulsed American probing operations before the Brazilians even arrived. But that context did not travel well up the Allied command chain. What traveled was the result. 4 attempts, 4 failures. The institutional assessment of the FEB, already skeptical, did not improve. Inside the Brazilian units, something more complex was happening than the Allied after-action reports captured. These men knew what the failures looked like from the outside. They knew the snake was still in the air, even if nobody was saying it to their faces. They had come across the Atlantic to prove something, and they had gone up the same mountain 4 times and come back down 4 times, and the mountain was still German. The psychological weight of that, on men already carrying their country's doubt, already operating in an environment nothing had prepared them for, was not a small thing. And yet the desertion rates in the FEB during this period were not high. Units maintained cohesion. Men went back up after the second failure, after the third, after the fourth. This is documented. It is one of the details that gets lost in the institutional narrative of failure, but it is present in the record for anyone who looks. They were not broken. They were stopped. Those are different things. January 1945 brought a relative lull in major offensive operations across the Fourth Corps front. Allied command was reassessing its approach to the Gothic Line sector. The operational calculus was being reworked. More artillery preparation, better air coordination, a more deliberate sequencing of efforts across the front rather than isolated assaults on individual objectives. A fifth assault on Monte Castelo was being planned. The date set was February 21, 1945. The FEB would lead it. Same mountain, same defenders, same approaches they had already climbed 4 times. What was different this time is not a simple answer. The artillery preparation was heavier. The coordination with the U.S. 10th Mountain Division on the flanking objectives was tighter. The timing had been worked and reworked through weeks of planning. But there was something else in the operational record from that period, something in the Brazilian unit logs and in the accounts of officers who were there, something that does not reduce neatly to logistics or fire support ratios. Whether it made a difference, and what happened when those men went up the mountain a 5th time, is where this story has been pointing since the beginning of this video, February 21, 1945. 0600 hours. The artillery preparation began before dawn, not the insufficient, poorly timed support that had preceded the 4 previous attempts. This was deliberate, sustained, and coordinated across the entire IV Corps front. American guns working the German positions on Monte Castelo, and the surrounding ridge system for hours before a single Brazilian soldier began moving uphill. The difference was not just volume. It was sequencing. Allied command had spent the January lull solving the coordination problem that had undermined every previous assault. The U.S. 10th Mountain Division, one of the most specialized units in the American Army, trained specifically for alpine warfare, was attacking simultaneously on the flanking objectives of Castelnuovo and the Della Spey Ridge. The German 148th could not concentrate its defensive fire on the Brazilian axis without exposing its flanks to the 10th Mountain. For the first time since November, Monte Castelo was being attacked as part of a genuinely coordinated operation rather than an isolated effort. The FEB's 1st Infantry Division went up the mountain. By mid-morning, the forward elements had penetrated the outer German defensive line. By early afternoon, they were fighting through the fortified positions that had stopped them 4 times before. The German 148th, compressed by pressure on multiple axes simultaneously, could not hold every position at once. The line that had been impenetrable through November and December began, position by position, to give. At 14:10 hours on February 21, 1945, Brazilian soldiers reached the summit of Monte Castelo. The mountain that had taken 4 attempts and a winter of casualties fell in a single day. There is a temptation at this moment in the story to reach for the kind of language that turns verified history into mythology. To describe the moment in terms of destiny or vindication or the settling of accounts. That temptation should be resisted. What happened on February 21st was not mythology. It was the product of corrected logistics, better fire coordination, a flanking operation that hadn't existed in the previous 4 attempts, and soldiers who went up a mountain they had already climbed and failed 4 times before. The result speaks without embellishment. Monte Castelo was in Brazilian hands by the afternoon of February 21st. The Fourth Corps axis of advance northward through the Reno Valley was open. The FEB had taken the objective that Allied planning had determined was essential to the entire offensive. What happened next happened fast. The spring offensive of 1945, Operation Encore, then folding into the broader Operation Grapeshot across the Italian front, moved with a momentum that the grinding attritional winter had made almost impossible to imagine. The German position in Italy, already stretched by the demands of the collapsing Eastern Front and the Allied advance through France and into Germany itself, began to come apart under sustained pressure. The FEB advanced northward through Montese in April 1945, a battle that cost the Brazilians significant casualties but secured a critical road junction. Through the Reno Valley, across the Po Plain, as German resistance fragmented and unit cohesion on the Axis side collapsed into retreat. And then came the moment that closes the loop on everything the snake idiom represented. The German 148th Infantry Division, the same division that had held Monte Castelo against 4 Brazilian assaults, that had sat in fortified positions above the FEB through an entire winter, that had represented in concrete military terms the proof that the skeptics might be right, was encircled by advancing FEB forces in the Po Valley in late April 1945. On April 28, 1945, the 148th Infantry Division surrendered to the Brazilians. The division that had stopped them became their prisoner. The men who had looked down from Monte Castelo at 4 failed assaults surrendered to the army their own country had doubted into existence. The record does not require commentary. It only requires reading. The final operational accounting of the FEB in Italy is documented in the official histories of both the Brazilian Army and the U.S. Fifth Army. The numbers are verified. They are not disputed. Approximately 25,334 Brazilian soldiers served in the Italian campaign. Of those, roughly 14,779 were directly engaged in combat operations. The FEB suffered 443 killed in action, more than 2,722 wounded, over 400 taken prisoner or missing. Non-combat casualties from illness and cold weather injuries added significantly to those figures across the winter campaign. In return, the FEB took approximately 20,573 prisoners of war. They captured 892 vehicles, 1,259 horses and mules, 979 artillery pieces and mortars, and quantities of small arms and ammunition that required dedicated logistics operations to process. These are not the numbers of a political gesture. These are the numbers of a force that fought a sustained combat campaign in one of the most difficult operational environments of the Second World War, and performed at a level that its own country and its allies had declared impossible before it began. General Mark Clark's assessment of the FEB by the end of the Italian campaign was documented in official correspondence and in his post-war writings. The commander who had received the Brazilians with the professional politeness that contained a fully formed opinion now put a different opinion on record. Clark wrote that the Brazilian soldiers had fought with courage and effectiveness, that their performance in the northern Apennines had contributed materially to the success of the Fifth Army's operations, and that they had earned their place in the Allied line without qualification. This was the same Allied command structure that had debated whether tropical soldiers could function in mountain winters. The record corrected itself. Not through argument, through performance. Other Allied assessments followed the same pattern. American liaison officers who had spent the winter documenting the FEB's coordination problems and equipment deficiencies were by spring documenting something else. Unit cohesion under sustained combat pressure, tactical adaptability, the kind of institutional resilience that is not produced by training manuals, but by men deciding repeatedly that they are going to continue. The snake in the language of everyone who had used that idiom to predict the FEB's failure, had lit the cigarette. It had not merely sailed. It had crossed the Atlantic, absorbed an Apennine winter, failed 4 times against the same mountain, gone up a 5th time, taken it, advanced through the Po Valley, and accepted the surrender of the division that had spent months trying to stop it. The idiom was settled. The account was closed. Or so it seemed. The war in Italy ended on May 2, 1945, with the surrender of German forces in the theater. 6 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Second World War in Europe was over. The FEB began preparing to go home. They had been in Italy for the better part of a year. They had buried 443 of their own in Italian soil. They had sent more than 2,700 men through field hospitals with wounds serious enough to be counted. They had taken a mountain their own country had bet against them taking, and they had done everything that had been asked of them, and more. They packed their equipment, processed their paperwork through American supply channels, said whatever needed to be said to the men they were leaving behind in Italian cemeteries, and boarded ships back across the Atlantic. Brazil was waiting for them. What Brazil did with them when they arrived is the part of this story that nobody put in the headlines. The ships came back to Rio de Janeiro in the second half of 1945. Not all at once. The repatriation happened in stages, the same way the deployment had, convoy by convoy, across the same Atlantic they had crossed going the other direction a year before. The men who stepped off those ships were not the same men who had boarded them in July 1944. That is not a dramatic observation. It is a plain one. They had spent months in the northern Apennines in winter. They had carried their dead-off Italian hillsides. They had gone up the same mountain 4 times and been stopped and gone up a 5th time and taken it. They had advanced through the Po Valley and accepted the surrender of a German division and watched the war end in a country that was not theirs. They came home carrying all of that. What they came home to was a Brazil that had moved on. Getulio Vargas had been deposed in October 1945, while many FEB soldiers were still in Italy or in the process of repatriation. The Estado Novo, Tio, the authoritarian government that had, after years of hesitation and internal resistance, finally sent these men to war, was gone. The political landscape had shifted entirely. A presidential election was scheduled. New factions were positioned. The country was looking forward, or at least sideways, at anything other than the recent past. The FEB did not fit neatly into any of the available political narratives. For those who had supported Vargas, the FEB was a complicated legacy, the one genuine achievement of a regime being dismantled. For those who had opposed Vargas, the FEB was associated with his government even if the soldiers themselves had nothing to do with his politics. For the new political establishment trying to build a democratic Brazil from the wreckage of the Estado Novo, the Expeditionary Force was a military institution with complicated loyalties and no obvious place in the emerging order. The simplest political solution, and the one that was effectively chosen, was institutional dissolution combined with public indifference. The FEB was officially deactivated on September 20, 1945. The unit ceased to exist as a formal military organization before the last of its soldiers had finished coming home. Its records were archived. Its command structure was dissolved. Its veterans were returned to their previous units or demobilized into civilian life without a coordinated transition program, without the kind of institutional support that men who had spent a year in combat have documented need for. There was no national monument, no dedicated memorial in the immediate post-war period, no equivalent of the recognition that other Allied nations extended to their returning veterans in those same months. They came back. The country looked away. The men themselves handled this in the ways that men in that situation generally handle it. They went back to their lives, farms, factories, offices, the streets of cities that had continued existing. without them while they were gone. They formed their own organizations, the Veterans Associations that would become for decades the primary institutional memory of the FEB's existence. The Associação Nacional dos Veteranos, the FEB, worked to keep the record alive when official Brazil showed limited interest in doing so. They held their own commemorations. They maintained their own archives. They buried their own dead, those who had not been left in Italian soil, with military honors that the state was not consistently providing. This is documented. It is not embellishment. The veterans of the FEB spent decades doing for themselves what their country did not do for them. General Mascarenhas de Moraes returned to Brazil and continued his military career. He rose to become Chief of Staff of the Brazilian Army. He wrote his memoirs of the Italian campaign, A FEB pelo seu comandante, published in 1947, a careful, thorough operational account that put the record on paper, while the record was still fresh. He understood that without documentation, the story would dissolve. He was right to be concerned. Mascarenhas died in 1968. By then, the FEB had been absent from Brazilian public consciousness for over 2 decades in any meaningful way. Military history in Brazil during the post-war period was shaped by other priorities, other conflicts, other political uses of the past. The expeditionary force that had taken Monte Castelo and captured a German division in the Po Valley occupied a peripheral position in the national narrative. His memoir survived. The operational record survived. The truth survived, but only in the places where someone had taken the deliberate trouble to preserve it. The rehabilitation of the FEB's history in Brazilian public memory was slow and uneven. It did not happen through a single act of recognition. It happened the way these things generally happen, gradually through the work of historians, through veterans keeping pressure on the question, through the passage of enough time that the political complications of the immediate post-war period lost their charge. February 21st is now commemorated in Brazil as the Dia do Expedicionário, Expeditionary Day, the date of Monte Castelo's fall. The Brazilian Army recognizes the FEB's campaign in its official history. There is a FEB museum in Rio de Janeiro. The veterans, most of whom are now gone, received formal recognition before they died. But recognition that arrives in old age or after death lands differently than recognition that meets men at the dock when they come home from war. The Italian campaign itself, the entire Allied effort up the peninsula from 1943 to 1945, occupies a strange position in the popular history of the Second World War. Overshadowed by Normandy, by the Pacific, by the Eastern Front scale, it is the campaign that Allied soldiers called the tough one, the forgotten one, the one where the ground never got easier, and the ice weather never cooperated, and the German defensive positions just kept appearing on the next ridge after you took the last one. The FEB fought in that campaign, in its hardest sector, in its worst winter, against a prepared enemy in mountain terrain that nothing in their experience had prepared them for. That is the verified record. It does not require inflation. Private soldiers do not leave memoirs. The men in the ranks of the FEB, the enlisted men from São Paulo and the rural Northeast, the black and mixed-race soldiers who made up the majority of the force, the men who had never seen snow before they climbed into the northern Apennines, most of them returned to lives that did not produce archives. They went back to being ordinary men in an ordinary country that had briefly asked them to do something extraordinary, and then found it inconvenient to remember that it had asked. Some of them talked about it. Most of them eventually did not. The snake is still out there, not as a symbol of failure. The failure it was coined to predict never materialized. The snake outlived every person who invented it, outlived the government that overcame it, outlived most of the men who proved it wrong. What the idiom means now is the opposite of what it meant when it was made. It means the thing everyone said was impossible. It means the proof that a country's doubt about itself is not necessarily the final word on what its people are capable of. But here is what the idiom cannot answer. Here is the question that the operational record, the Veterans Associations, the February 21st commemorations, and the museum in Rio de Janeiro have not fully resolved. What do you owe the men who proved you wrong? Not in monuments, not in museum plaques or official histories published decades after the fact. What do you owe them in the moment, when they step off the ship, when they hand you back the proof you demanded, when they come home carrying Italian mud and the faces of the men they left in Italian cemeteries? Brazil asked that question with its silence in 1945. It has been answering it slowly ever since. Whether the answer has been enough is something each person watching this has to decide for themselves. The men who could have told you what they thought about it are almost all gone now. The snake is still smoking.